Hello thinkers, we hope you enjoy episode 2 of this important discussion on the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions found at el-Khadim and in other areas of Egypt. If you feel led to support Mori Michael's translational work on these inscriptions, please visit his GoFundMe page, www.gofundme.com/f/Exodus-tablets. You can also find the link to this GoFundMe page in the episode description.
What I understand is it became the basis of all alphabets that then spread throughout the world. Is that correct?
That's correct. And in fact, it seems very clear that even during the time of our sojourn in Egypt, this system began to spread and would become different branches of Semitic script, what would become the Arabian scripts, what would become the Assyrian scripts. It's very interesting that although what we call Hebrew today, is actually Assyrian script, also called Aramaic script, the same, and as opposed to what they call Paleo-Hebrew, which is really the authentic branch that we were using throughout all of the both temple periods. We're starting to transition into that Assyrian Aramaic script later on. But even that script, which we are using today and we know as Hebrew writing, that also came from Proto-Sinaitic or a Proto-Alphabetic.
Yes, and in fact, in the Moses controversy, we showed sort of this progression through time. And then as you looked at how similar it was, some people say, well, the Phoenicians created this alphabet. That's where we get the word phonetics. I don't know who wants to talk to that, because this goes back earlier than that. So anyone want to explain that? Because if anyone's heard that, which we all heard, they say these are phonetics. The alphabet came from Phoenicians. My understanding is that's not correct. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I would like to add something to that, because some of the classical authors, I think including Tacitus, the Roman classical author, actually went beyond that. It was known by the classical authors that the alphabetic script originated as Phoenician, but there were others who went beyond that and said, actually, this is wrong. This script comes from Egypt. And actually, we already find that in the classical writings. Now we know it did come from Egypt, but it was actually written by Western Asiatics, most likely the biblical Israelites, who were then in Egypt, who developed the script. But it was known by some classical authors that it had originated in Egypt.
So what's interesting about this, Mori Michael, is that the shapes of the letters, this is the reason why your connection here is very critical, because you, being a rabbi, understood the shapes of the letters, correct, of Hebrew.
Absolutely. But I should just add that because of that, it was very easy for me to just teach myself long before I came into this, what's called Paleo-Hebrew, because even what they call Paleo-Hebrew is very much based on the same shapes, like you're saying, just a little different.
The bottom line of this in the Moses controversy, and with what your work is that people who were descendants of Abraham, sons of Jacob, were in Egypt. And during that time of Joseph, let's say, he took Egyptian hieroglyphs and made them into phonetic Hebrew letters, correct?
I think it is important because we don't want a gaps argument. Perhaps all the evidence hasn't come in. There are all sorts of different ideas that perhaps, discoveries that they are making in Syria, for example, or, Mesopotamia, or even the land of Israel, the land of Canaan of those times, may suggest that the concept of this phonetic alphabet based on the hieroglyphs actually came from the East and came into Egypt with the Semites. And that is possible. In other words, it's not an absolute given that Joseph must have created this. That does make good sense, but we should leave open the possibility that Jacob's sons brought this alphabet from the Levant. And that makes actually very good sense. And it's very profound because it is at that point that we begin seeing an explosion of Proto-Sinaitic, Proto-Alphabetic in Egypt and in Sinai, not before. So whether Joseph is the actual person, who created this, or he was simply the one who helped establish it in Egypt, both of those are very profound possibilities.
Yeah, Pieter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would think so. I think indeed there's a good possibility that, in fact, there may be evidence of Proto-Alphabetic writing even before that time. But as Mori Michael rightly said, it is only from the late 12th dynasty onwards, the time where we date the descent of Jacob and his sons into Egypt, that we find a far more systematized alphabetic script. Nowhere do we have that many inscriptions related to a specific group that partly lived in the Eastern Delta, also there where the Israelites are supposed to have lived according to the biblical text, and in Western Sinai, where indeed many people from Egypt, Asiatics, were working for Pharaoh. It is at this point that we find actually you could say an explosion of alphabetic scripts. So it could be that we had some forerunners, but here we find something that is developed in a very explosive way. Now, naturally, Joseph may have played an important role here. Naturally, there were also especially so during the first part of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt, there were many more high-ranking Israelite people who would have taken on and would have developed this even more. I suppose this was a development, this was something in progress that would not have come about from one day to another. I'm sure it would have taken some time, but I think the person, the motor, the engine behind this could well have been Joseph.
I should just add that one thing that I became very impressed with from my discussions with Dr. Ludwig Morenz and, really mastering his textbook. He wrote the textbook essentially on these inscriptions, is how many of these inscriptions are clearly dated to the time of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, who we very confidently tie to the time of Joseph.
The issue at stake originally, what we wanted to discuss was, could it be that Moses had access to older inscriptions that he could have incorporated into his own text?
In light of him being a prince, and according to both revised chronology of Dr. van der Veen and new chronology of David Rohl, he would have been raised in the court of the Pharaoh shortly after the time of Hammurabi. And so as a prince of Egypt, he would have been very well familiar with cuneiform, the type of writing, the type of script that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have been writing in.
Yes. No, I understand that's an option, naturally. The Akkadian script was the lingua franca, like English is today. So having been brought up in Egypt, Moses had a very good training, and he would have known all these languages, including Akkadian, and so he would have had access to these inscriptions. But this is only one part of the story. The other thing is, of course, the option that we may have precursor Proto-Alphabetic inscriptions, which may be as old or even older than Abraham. There is the option that Abraham's own scribes could have written down his experiences with God, the story, everything that's relating to his days. And so there may have been actually Proto-Alphabetic inscriptions which could have been handed down to Moses and which were then incorporated into the biblical text. I would not want to exclude that possibility. once we find that also people before the time of Joseph were able to read and write. Now, whether they used the Akkadian script, they used a simpler Proto-Alphabetic script, they were able to write down what they had experienced with God. And these texts could have been handed down to Moses. So even in the time before Moses, the patriarchs could have had a written language.
That's very encouraging. And to be quite honest, it's the first time that I've ever really talked about this with anyone. So what you are both opening the door for, and I appreciate that, Mori Michael and Pieter, is that you're saying that these Hebrews, even to this day, are very intelligent people. What we do know is that looking at what the shapes of these letters are, these hieroglyphics, whether they were from the time of Joseph or earlier from the time of Abraham, or whatever writing form, it's very possible then that leading up, who knows if there was even a writing form that Noah was involved with. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. But the fact that there was some form of communicating the past, in some kind of document that would have been passed on, the word of the Lord was being documented. And that's what patterns of evidence is about, is does God act in history? Can we see a pattern of God acting in history? So where a lot of your work has been involved is at a very specific site at el-Khadim. And there are two peaks there, Jebel Sinai and Jebel Horeb. And what you're suggesting is this Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb? And at these peaks is where these inscriptions have been found, and you are translating them, which is something that a lot of people have tried to do. So, Mori Michael, what's the connection and what's the big aha? Because at Mount Sinai, we know, and I'm going to give the audience a little bit of a clue here, is that there was the worship of the golden calf. And there is a big connection in your work with this idolatry and what was happening at this mountain. Help the audience to understand what you find significant in these inscriptions and the connection between the golden calf.
The Bedouins preserved this name Ghoriba, and those are etymologically, in terms of the way that words are passed down and merge, they are identical. They are somebody's Sinai and Horeb, and not belonging to any particular cult. And when I say that, I don't mean like a cult. I mean any sort of a religious tradition. And it is tremendously powerful because at the foot, essentially, right in the backdrop with those mountains looming large in the distance, what you see from these inscriptions is basically that seems to be ground zero for a revolution against the golden calf cult. And I say that with so much self-criticism. And I don't want anyone to come away with this idea that this is Holy Spirit upon me, that I am, coming here to pontificate. And it's extremely important to understand that one of the points that does separate my work from that of others is just how open I am to all the different opinions and understanding that it takes a village. And what I mean by that, I don't mean just the scholars of our time, but even over the last century. And, relating to those opinions and being afraid of error. And what I mean by that, not just before later generations that will, judge my work with, better tools, because technology is always getting better, but before God. What do these inscriptions really truly say? Are they actually perhaps championing Baalat? And this is something that I'm very honest about in my work, is I actually give you the key of how to falsify my thesis if it is false. If these inscriptions could actually be glorifying the golden calf cult, then that would really neutralize what I'm bringing. But what gives me the confidence at this time, I can actually say now that I have read and interpreted and come to an understanding of all, the full set of Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions that are in the authoritative textbook of Dr. Ludwig Morens. And so I can now say that I've seen pretty much the full picture. Just to really ground this for people, okay? Moses and Aaron come to the Pharaoh. Let my people go, says Moses, 3 days into the desert that they may serve me. Now, whatever, we understand about the Pharaoh, that this was a very wicked and very stubborn man. An idiot, he was not. And this needed to have been an argument that would have had the potential to convince him. So what does 3 days into the desert mean? So let's not think, in terms of the Israelites moving slowly with their animals and with, the sick among us. But imagine a fleet-footed runner, bringing mail from the capital, from, being sent by the king, by royal decree, all the way to the place of seasonal operations where the slaves were actually working. That is Serabit el-Khadim. 3 days into the desert, there needed to have been a center that the Pharaoh would have been familiar with, that, this is where they're going to go serve their God. Where is a place where we actually see inscriptions lauding El, God, Ha'el, and calling him Av, Father, Ha'av, and actually cursing out and admonishing the followers of Baalat? We find it indeed what would have been 3 days out of Egypt, which of course would have taken the later exodusing Israelites weeks and weeks to arrive. So that is what we're talking about, Serabit el-Khadim, which literally means in Arabic, the cave of the slaves. All in the backdrop of these two very looming mountains in the background. They're not, extremely small or tiny in the distance. And this was a surprise to me. I have you guys to thank, for these incredible images, where we actually see Jebel Sania and Jebel Horiba, which literally mean Sinai and Horeb. Enter oral tradition, both of the Jews and a very ancient people who I believe to actually be a continuing ember, you can say, of the Kohanic establishment of the northern kingdom, the Samaritans. And both of our camps, who do not recognize the other, have this tradition that Sinai and Horeb were two twin peaks. You have the Ibn Ezra bringing it down, and you actually have this in Samaritan tradition as well. And that's in fact what we see there. And what you find in these inscriptions, and this is very important, is a whole slew of different types of inscriptions. And this is what the new paper coming out, I'm very excited about it, is going to show, that you have a clade of inscriptions of people who worshipped the Baalat. You have a clade of inscriptions of people who worshipped El, who worshipped God. And by the way, these included inscriptions which accompanied offerings, gifts, And you have also clades of inscriptions that are, rebuking the people against the worship of Baalat. And you have something even more powerful. You have Baalat, that means Hathor, or the golden calf deity. Just remember this, guys. Whenever I say Baalat, it means the golden calf deity, This is the cult that Moses and the Israelites moved to eradicate in the desert at the foot of Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. So you have what they call votive, meaning worshipful inscriptions, lauding this idol. And you have clearly an el-serving, a God-serving scribe coming in and basically hacking, canceling out certain letters, and in fact turning the message into a God-serving one. This is so powerful because we see that this is, ground zero, for this conflict. You have in there a mention of the gate, the gate of the accursed one, Sha'ar ben Qab, which literally means in Hebrew, the gate of the accursed one in male. This is like, the gate of, the Pharaoh. What's very interesting is that the Pharaoh Amenemhat III, representing, of course, the crown of Egypt, is the one who actually built a temple for this golden calf cult right there. So you can just imagine, very angered Israelite establishment who are cursing out the gate of this temple. And you see it was burned. In other words, there's actually evidence in the archaeology that suggests that it was burned. There was clearly a group of people who were motivated very powerfully, spiritually, against this cult. A lot of these inscriptions are so colorful. They just bring to life life in those times. Your heart goes out to these Hebrew slaves and the way that they're writing. Like one of them says, Nachon, Samahat Ba'alat, sure, make Ba'alat happy, make the golden calf deity happy. But there's no strength. We will die. It's very, very powerful. You have a later scribe coming in and crossing out, obliterating a cultic symbol of the Hathor cult, which is this fish. And all of this is resting on an establishment understandings of all of these symbols. It's important to understand that my letter identifications, they all need to check out, not by a simple audience, but by the scholars in the field. And this is what keeps me up at night. And now what will separate what I am about to post, it's a proto paper that will be the foundation of my master's and hopefully PhD thesis, is a consistent alphabet of showing precisely every single letter, okay, its exact hieroglyphic root, perfectly consistent across all 22 inscriptions that I'm presenting. In one inscription, we see a gratitude being shown for a kind slave master, and etching a message of thanks on a rock cliff right next to symbols of the monarchy of Pharaoh Amenemhat III. You see life happening, and of course you also have inscriptions in hopes that God will save them from the master.
So that would be a connection to the Israelites. What you're suggesting is the Israelites who were serving in those mines, calling on God to save them, which was what God told Moses at the burning bush. I've heard the cries of my people. This is very, very complex, and not many people are brave enough to actually try to go in and solve these problems. You have these inscriptions that have no breaks in the letters, and you could read them up and down or left or right, and you've got to make sense of it. Some of the letters are hard to read. Your thesis is that you have a formalized way to identify which are the Hebrew letters according to these Proto-Sinaitic letters, right? And that you're going to then give interpretations. And as I remember it, a lot of these interpretations are showing that there was the worship of a golden calf god. Is the word Moses in these inscriptions as well?
So the only way that you can really do this in a very serious way is you need to try not to find Moses. I know that sounds strange. I know that will sound, in fact, very difficult for the audience to hear. But people need to understand, for people who believe, you don't need any of this, right? Suppose, for example, these finds don't exactly pan out. I won't cease to believe in God and worship him according to my traditions, and neither will you. Okay? But the reason why we endeavor in this is to be able to find if there are extraordinary evidence that basically anyone, okay, who is trained can actually see. And therefore, I took a very critical view of this idea that, you just see Moses just jumping all over the place and all over these inscriptions. And I don't want to put down my colleagues. We all learn from one another, even those who I really strongly disagree with. When it comes to everyone's letter identifications, you want to see what all the smart people in the field are identifying. Thanks to your high-resolution inscriptions, and those are the only ones that I work with, high-res images, and different ones from different scholars, sometimes from different periods, sometimes a black and white high-res image can actually be preferable to a color one because it's all about the shadows. That, and working with casts of the original inscriptions, they were kept in the Harvard University at the Semitic Museum in their basement, and actually working with these hands-on and holding them against the light. There are such differences between an image, a picture of an inscription being held at this angle as opposed to that angle. Anyway, you guys provided is one of the highest resolution image that exists. I can say that with fairly good confidence. And I found something that absolutely blew me away. In an inscription, which I speculated humbly could have been written, by Moses and his entourage, next to this pillar of text, right next to it, it says in Hebrew, Zot mi Moshe. This is from Moses. First thing that I did was to show it to my academic supervisor because, if he is going to support this, he has a much bigger reputation to protect than I do. And I showed him, he saw exactly the same thing. It is the Mine El inscriptions, which you guys actually made famous. In the movie in which I had a small cameo about these inscriptions with David Roll, if you remember, I suggested, and this really could be from Moses because it seems to mention the man, the manna. And right next to it, in small letters, just like you have another inscription, which appears to be by another scribe at the bottom, approbating, or, saying, Shema, hearken to this large message. Right next to it, you have the letters. It's very clear. Zan, which is Z, Taf, which is Ta, Mem, which is Ma, and a Shin, which is Sha. Zot mi Moshe. This is from Moses. In other words, you have, a later person coming in and in small print, not incising it sharply. In the same way that I interpreted this first inscription, that this fellow Arba, perhaps was a Levitical leader, perhaps he was a minor chieftain, is telling the reader to hearken to this main message. What's incredible is there are two main inscriptions that have the highest value, you can say, of all of these inscriptions, and that is because they are found what is called in situ, and that's a fancy word meaning in their place. It's not just in a pile of rubble in front of these mines. And it happens to be that this Mine El inscription, which you made famous, is right next to, unsurprisingly, 358, which for me personally is the most awe-inspiring inscription of them all, and really reads as a prayer to God to save the people. It says very clearly, El De'elem, which means God of the hidden, or God who is hidden, the hidden God. And then below it, Melech, meaning king. And in fact, it may actually be exactly like in 357, Malkecha, your king. And this is something that distinguishes my work also from that of others, where I color code the letters, showing that which is visible to anyone, that which is clearly visible to someone with a high-res image, which I can see, and elements which are a little more speculative. And so I always bring that element of honesty into it. But you have at the very least Melech, king, and I understand it to actually say Malkecha, your king. And then it comes around and says Hatzilam, save them. It's something that gives me so much inspiration, in my own life, because these read as songs. One of the things are, poems, they rhyme. And this is something that, I don't want to steal fire from my paper, but I'm going to show how these, which could have been from Moses, and that's seems pretty likely. And that's another huge point. You gave, in your thinker style, different points for the different possible locations of Mount Sinai. How many of them have "this is from Moses" in an inscription among a set of inscriptions that are clearly bringing ground zero of the conflict, of the struggle, the revolution against the golden calf cult to life?
Please stay tuned for episode 3 of this important discussion. And as always, keep thinking.